Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey, listener name, are you ready for this? We're going deep into the U.S. Constitution today.
Sounds intense.
It is, but it's fascinating stuff. And we're
Yeah.
specifically looking at how the Constitution dealt with African Americans in its early years, or, maybe more accurately, how it didn't deal with them. And you've given us a ton of great sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, podcasts, legal cases, historical texts. It's a lot.
It is.
Mm.
We're going for that full picture here, no stone unturned, so let's jump right in.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so picture this, 1787, the Constitutional Convention. Everyone's gathered trying to figure out this whole new government thing, right?
Huge moment in history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this massive issue pops up, how to count enslaved people.
Ah, yes. This sets the stage for so much conflict later on.
Exactly. The southern states, they're heavily reliant on slave labor, so they wanted enslaved people counted as part of the population.
More population equals more power in Congress, right?
Got it. And the northern states,
Mm.
well, they weren't so keen on that idea.
Big disagreement right off the bat.
Totally. And that's where this thing called the Three-Fifths Compromise comes in.
Ugh. Three-fifths compromise. Every time I hear that, it just, I don't know.
It's rough. It's really rough.
It's basically saying that each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in Congress and for taxation purposes.
It's dehumanizing, plain and simple.
Absolutely. It shows just how messed up the relationship between slavery and political power was in the early U.S.
Totally. And here's the thing. This compromise, it wasn't just some theoretical political chess move.
Oh, no. This had real consequences.
Real and devastating consequences. More representation for the southern states meant they had more power to create laws. And guess what a lot of those laws did?
Protected slavery.
You got it. It's like they baked this system of racial injustice right into the foundation of the country.
And it's not just the Three-Fifths Compromise. We also have to look at how the Constitution dealt with state powers.
Yeah.
Things like education, law enforcement, and voting rights.
So the states had a lot of control over these areas.
A lot, especially the southern states. And this gave them the legal tools to basically control and often deny basic rights to African Americans.
Especially those who were enslaved.
Yes,
So
exactly.
you're saying this system basically forced the federal government to enforce laws that protected slavery even if they disagreed with it.
You got it. And a prime example of that is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793.
Remind me what that one was all about.
So this act allowed slaveholders to cross state lines to recapture enslaved people who had escaped, even if those people had made it to a free state.
Oh, wow. So even if an enslaved person managed to escape to a state where slavery was illegal,
It didn't matter. This act said they could still be captured and returned to slavery.
that's intense.
Yeah.
So how did the northern states react to that?
A lot of them resisted. They saw it as a violation of their state sovereignty and created all sorts of conflicts between state and federal power.
Sounds like a preview of the Civil War.
You could definitely argue that. It's like this one document that was supposed to bring the nation together also planted the seeds for this huge division.
It's pretty wild to think about, isn't it? So, listener name, I'm curious. As you were looking at these sources, what were your thoughts on these early conflicts between state and federal power? Did anything surprise you?
What's really interesting is how these sources offer all these different perspectives on how the Constitution treated African Americans.
Oh, yeah. Like what kind of perspectives?
Well, you've got the traditional view, which really emphasizes the idea of compromise. It was all about creating a unified nation, even if it meant making some morally questionable choices.
And then on the other side, you have,
Then you have perspectives that see the Constitution as inherently flawed from the get-go.
because of slavery.
Right. Some even go so far as to call it a covenant with death because of how it accepted slavery.
That's a powerful statement. It's like we're looking at the same document, but through completely different lenses.
Exactly. And a really powerful example of this is Frederick Douglass,
Oh, man, Frederick Douglass. Such an incredible figure.
an icon.
Right.
He was this brilliant abolitionist leader. And at first, he absolutely slammed the Constitution, called it a pro-slavery document. But
Yeah.
then later on in his life, his perspective shifted. He started to believe that the Constitution, if interpreted in a certain way, could actually be used to support the fight against slavery.
It must have been a huge mental and emotional shift for him.
Absolutely. And this internal struggle wasn't unique to Douglass. A lot of abolitionists grappled with this question. Was the Constitution ultimately a tool for slavery or against it?
Such a tough question.
Really tough. And some argued that certain clauses, mention specific clauses from listener sources, could be used to dismantle the institution of slavery. What do you think, listener name? Based on what you've read, do those arguments hold up?
It's a question worth pondering, because these weren't just abstract debates happening in some ivory tower. They played out in courtrooms with real-world consequences.
Exactly. And one of the big cases that highlights this is Prigg v. Pennsylvania in 1833.
Oh, yeah. What happened there?
Well, the Supreme Court basically sided with the Fugitive Slave Act. They said that the federal government's power to protect slavery overrode the objections of individual states.
So even if a state wanted to protect escaped slaves?
They couldn't. The federal law took precedence.
Wow. And then, of course, there's the Dred Scott decision in 1857.
Dred Scott. One of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in American history.
It's horrifying.
It's not just that it upheld slavery, it went way further. Declared that African Americans had no rights that a white man was bound to respect.
Essentially denying them citizenship and any protection under the Constitution.
Exactly. And this decision, it sent shockwaves through the nation. It was one of the major events that pushed the country closer to the Civil War.
It's chilling to read that decision now. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be an African American in that era, facing such blatant denial of basic human rights. Listener name. What were your initial reactions when you first came across this case in your research?
I mean, it's unsettling, right? This document, the Constitution, it's supposed to guarantee liberty and justice, and yet here it is being used to deny those very things to an entire group of people.
It's a stark reminder of the gap between our ideals and the reality of how things played out.
For sure. And it's important to remember that this isn't just ancient history.
Right. It's still relevant today.
Absolutely. These compromises, these legal decisions, they cast a long shadow. They set a precedent that took generations to challenge.
And we're still dealing with consequences.
Exactly.
Right.
Even after the Civil War and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, the fight for equality was far from over.
It's like the ghosts of those original compromises kept haunting the nation, even as it tried to move forward.
And that's why understanding this history is so crucial. It helps us see how those early decisions about race and power shaped the legal and social landscape for generations to come.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Constitution, the compromises, the legal battles. It's a lot to process, for sure. But before we jump into the next part of our deep dive, let's just take a moment. Listener name. What are some of the things that stand out to you so far? What's sparking your curiosity?
It seems like you've really dug deep into these sources, listener name. You're not just looking at the events themselves, but also how historians have interpreted this complicated legacy.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting, right? It's not about memorizing facts and figures. It's about grappling with the different ways people have understood the Constitution, especially when it comes to African Americans.
Exactly. And we see that tension so clearly in the different schools of thought around this. You've got the traditionalist view. They really focus on the Constitution as this incredible achievement, a groundbreaking document for its time.
They'd probably argue that the compromises on slavery were, well, morally troubling, of course, but necessary to create a unified nation.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, you can't judge the Founding Fathers by today's standards. They were products of their time.
It's the whole presentism debate, right? Like, can we really judge historical figures by our modern values?
Exactly. They see the Constitution as a pragmatic document, the framers doing the best they could given the circumstances. But then you have historians who take a much more critical view.
Especially those coming from an abolitionist perspective.
Right. They see the Constitution as fundamentally flawed right from the start.
Some even calling it a covenant with death.
Because of its acceptance of slavery. And that's a powerful image. It forces us to confront the human cost of those compromises.
Not just political maneuvering, but decisions with real and devastating consequences for millions of people.
And then you have the critical race theory perspective, which argues that the Constitution wasn't just flawed, it was deliberately designed to protect the interests of white property owners, including slaveholders.
So it wasn't just about compromise, it was about power.
Right. They see things like the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause as tools for creating and maintaining a racial hierarchy.
So we've got these different lenses to view the Constitution through compromise power interpretation. But how do these lenses shape our understanding of what happened after the Constitution was ratified? I mean, things didn't just stay the same, right?
Oh, definitely not. And this is where the idea of legal constitutionalism comes into play.
Legal constitutionalism, what's that all about?
It recognizes the deep flaws of the original document, but it also suggests that the Constitution had the potential to change, to evolve and be corrected over time.
And that's where the amendment process comes in, right?
Exactly.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those were all passed during Reconstruction to abolish slavery, grant citizenship, and protect voting rights for African Americans.
And those amendments weren't just abstract legal ideas. They were huge victories fueled by the hard work and sacrifice of so many people. Abolitionists, activists, and formerly enslaved people themselves. They were fighting to fundamentally change the nation.
It's inspiring to think about their dedication and courage in the face of such overwhelming obstacles.
Absolutely. And we see this constant push and pull between those who wanted to hold on to the status quo and those who were demanding change. It's almost as if both sides were using the Constitution as both a weapon and a shield in this ongoing struggle for equality.
That's a powerful way to put it. And the echoes of that battle continue even today, right? In the debates over voting rights, affirmative actions, the ongoing fight for racial justice, the shadow of those early compromises is still very much with us.
And that's why it's so important to understand this history. It helps us see how these early decisions about race and power have shaped our legal and social landscape for generations.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. This document written so long ago still has such a profound impact on our lives today. So listener name, as you were going through these sources, were there any particular stories or figures that stood out to you? Whose voice resonated most strongly?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, right? The laws and the court cases and the political battles.
Definitely.
But it's important to remember that these were real people's lives that were affected by these decisions. Absolutely. And your sources actually do a great job of bringing those personal stories to light.
Like who?
Well, for example, there's James Madison, the father of the Constitution.
Yeah.
His notes from the Constitutional Convention, they show how much disagreement there was about slavery, even among the founding fathers.
It wasn't just a North versus South thing.
No, not at all. The question of how to handle slavery and representation, it was a really hot topic, even among the people who were literally creating the nation.
Makes you realize that the founding fathers weren't these perfect mythical beings.
Right.
They were human. They had flaws, just like everyone else.
Exactly.
And speaking of contradictions, let's get back to Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
We talked earlier about how he first saw the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, and then later on he changed his mind.
Yeah, his story is so powerful.
It really shows how even those directly impacted by these injustices could have different interpretations of the Constitution.
And find hope for the future.
Right. I was reading about how Douglass came to believe that the Constitution's preamble, that very beginning, we the people, he thought that could actually be used to argue against slavery.
Interesting. How so?
He believed that the whole idea of equality and liberty that's right there in those opening words, clashes with the idea of slavery.
So he saw those principles as a condemnation of slavery.
Exactly. And he wasn't alone. A lot of abolitionists started looking at other parts of the Constitution, too.
Like which ones?
Like the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment.
They saw those as potential tools to dismantle slavery.
Exactly. It just goes to show that the meaning of the Constitution, it's always evolving.
It's open to interpretation and reinterpretation.
Right. It's not enough to just read the words. You have to understand the context, the history, the different ways those words have been used and understood.
And we can't forget that those legal arguments weren't happening in isolation.
They were part of this much bigger fight for freedom and equality.
Exactly. Think about the people who risked everything to escape slavery on the Underground Railroad. The people who fought in the Civil War.
And the women who were leading the charge in the abolitionist movement.
Right. Fighting for racial justice and women's rights at the same time.
It's inspiring. It reminds us that change doesn't just happen because of laws or court cases.
It takes the courage and determination of everyday people.
People who say no to injustice.
And their struggle. It reminds us that the fight for equality didn't end with the Civil War.
Or even with the Reconstruction Amendments.
Exactly. It continued through the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, and let's be real, it's still going on today.
The fight for equal rights, equal opportunities,
Right.
The fight to truly live up to the idea of we the people, it's not over.
It's an ongoing story, and we're all part of it.
So listener name as we wrap up this deep dive. What's your biggest takeaway? What's sticking with you? What are you thinking about differently now when it comes to the Constitution and African Americans and how those two things have been intertwined throughout history?
For me, it really drives home the point that the Constitution isn't this fixed, unchanging document.
Yeah, it's not set in stone.
It's a living, breathing thing. It's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted.
And that interpretation, it changes with each generation.
Exactly. It's shaped by the social and political and cultural forces of the time.
It's like a mirror reflecting back on us, showing us who we are as a nation, what we value, what we're still struggling with.
And as we continue to grapple with these issues of race and equality today, it's more important than ever to understand this history.
The long shadow of those early compromises, the ongoing fight to truly achieve justice and liberty for all.
Well said.
It's been a fascinating journey, listener name, exploring this complex and sometimes difficult part of American history. We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective, some things to think about, and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring the story on your own.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.